All right, let's jump right in. When you really get down to it, the Book of Mormon doesn't start with some dense theology. It kicks off with a survival story, a really intense account of a family's escape from a city that's about to be completely destroyed. It's all about faith, family drama, and taking a massive leap into the unknown.
So, to really get why they were in such a hurry, you've got to look at the history here. We're talking around 600 BC, and Jerusalem is in a really bad spot. Babylon is in charge, and prophets are shouting from the rooftops that the city is doomed. And this wasn't just some vague prediction. Look at this timeline. In less than 15 years, the city would be wiped off the map. So for this family, the stakes were literally life and death.
So our story kicks off right there, at that exact tipping point, and it focuses on a prophet, a man named Lehi, and a divine warning that completely upends his family's world but ultimately is meant to save them.
So you've got this guy, Lehi. He lives in Jerusalem, and he is just heartbroken by the wickedness he sees all around him. So he goes and prays, not just for himself, but for his entire people. And that one prayer, it kicks off this incredible, world-changing chain of events.
As he's praying, something unbelievable happens. A pillar of fire appears right in front of him. The account says he saw and heard so much that it made him tremble and quake exceedingly. Just completely overwhelmed, he heads back to his house, and once he's there, he's totally overcome by the Spirit and falls into a vision. It's described as if the heavens themselves just opened up right in front of him.
And then he sees a divine being coming down out of heaven, someone whose brightness was beyond anything he'd ever seen, brighter than the sun at noon. This being, followed by 12 others, comes and gives Lehi a book and tells him to read it.
And the message in that book? Absolutely terrifying. It was a crystal-clear prophecy. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Its people will either die by the sword or be dragged off as captives to Babylon. There was no ambiguity here.
So what does Lehi do? Exactly what he was told. He goes out and warns the people. And how did they react? They laughed at him. They mocked him. And when he went even further and testified that a Messiah would come, they got so angry that they tried to kill him, just like they'd done to so many prophets before.
Okay, so here's where we get a really important idea from the narrator of the story, Lehi's son Nephi. He frames this whole escape through the lens of what he calls the tender mercies of the Lord. It's basically his way of saying, hey, reader, pay attention. I'm about to show you how God steps in with these very personal, individualized acts of deliverance, even when everything looks completely hopeless.
And that divine protection comes in the form of a pretty shocking command, which kicks off the next part of this saga, leaving absolutely everything they've ever known behind. I mean, imagine this. The command from God is direct and non-negotiable. Take your wife, Saria Lori, your 4 sons, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi, and just go. Escape into the wilderness. And they have to leave it all behind. Their house, their land, their gold, their silver, everything. But they've barely even started their journey. They've barely gotten their bearings in the wilderness when the Lord gives them their first huge test. And it's a command that's going to reveal a major crack within the family itself. The 4 brothers are told to turn right around and go all the way back to Jerusalem. And what's the mission? They have to get a sacred record, the brass plates, from this really powerful and dangerous guy named Laban. This is an insane request. They have to go back to the very city where their father is a wanted man. And this command immediately splits the brothers right down the middle. You've got Laman and Lemuel, the 2 oldest, and they just start complaining. They call it a hard thing and are totally convinced it's impossible. But Nephi? His reaction couldn't be more different. He says he wanted to know God's mysteries and that his heart was softened. He actually believed God wouldn't give them an order like this without also giving them a way to pull it off. This moment right here sets up the core conflict for their whole story. And this is Nephi's legendary response. It's this huge declaration of faith, but it's more than just simple obedience, right? It's a statement of a core belief that any command from God comes with a built-in promise that there's a path to get it done. And it's that belief that lets him move forward when everyone else is paralyzed by fear and doubt.
So, let's see how this actually plays out, because this next part of the story is all about what it looks like to act on that kind of faith, especially when you have no earthly idea what you're doing.
So, their first couple of tries are based on, human logic, and they fail spectacularly. First, they try to just buy the plates, but Laban just steals their family fortune and tries to have them killed. At that point, Laman and Lemuel are done. They give up and even start beating up their younger brothers. But Nephi, he decides to go back one more time, alone, into the city, at night, with zero plan. just pure trust in God.
And this quote right here, this is everything. It's the perfect description of what it means to operate on faith. He's not following a map. He's trusting that the next step will appear right when he needs it. It's like driving in the dark. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you trust the road is there.
And that spiritual guidance leads to the most shocking and difficult moment in the entire story. Nephi finds Laban passed out drunk in the street, and the Spirit commands him to kill Laban. Nephi actually argues against it at first, but the Spirit insists, giving this reason. Without the scriptures on those plates, an entire future nation of their descendants would eventually fall into unbelief. So in this moment, one man's life is weighed against the spiritual survival of a whole nation.
With that incredibly difficult mission now accomplished, the focus shifts to why. Why was this so important? Why risk everything for this record? What was on these plates that made them worth all this?
You can just imagine the scene when they get back to the camp in the wilderness. Their parents are just overwhelmed with joy and relief. And as soon as Lehi gets his hands on the plates, he dives right in, studying them, and is just filled with the Spirit as he reads about his own ancestors.
So what exactly was this treasure they went through so much for? Well, it was basically their entire heritage. It had the 5 books of Moses, what we call the Torah. It had a history of their people going all the way back. It had prophecies from prophets like Isaiah. And crucially, it had their family tree, their genealogy, connecting them right back to that history. So in the end, these plates were so much more than just a book. They were described as being of great worth because they were the key to their future. Without them, as they went off to start a new civilization, they'd lose their language, their culture, and most importantly, their knowledge of God. It was their spiritual and cultural survival kit.
You know, this entire epic journey started with a command that seemed impossible, what the brothers called a hard thing. And it only happened because one person was willing to move forward without a clear plan. So it leaves us with this really interesting question to think about. What is it that gives people faith to take that first step when the path ahead is completely dark?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really critical story. It's an excavation, really, of an ancient journey that had massive consequences.
It really did.
We're focusing on a family forced to flee Jerusalem around 600 BC, all because of some pretty intense prophetic warnings.
And when you say intense, you're not kidding.
So our mission here is to really pull out the key lessons. You know, things about obedience when you're under extreme pressure.
Yeah.
The huge value of Scripture and what it actually means to get a divine call when you're in a hostile environment.
Right. And to really get the urgency, you have to understand the setting. We're starting this story right at the beginning of King Zedekiah's reign in Judah.
And this wasn't a great time, was it?
Oh, not at all. It wasn't stable. It wasn't a pious time. The sources we have paint a picture of a moral climate that was just plummeting. There was rampant wickedness, stealing, murder, gross immorality. And they were actively worshiping the false god Baal. Jerusalem was, it was spiritually rotten from the inside out. And politically, they were playing a really dangerous game with the big empires rising up around them.
So the whole city was basically a powder keg, ready to blow from the inside and the outside. And Lehi, who is our central figure here, he wasn't the only one seeing this.
No, far from it. He might have been mocked for it, but he was not alone in his message. That's a key point.
So there were others.
Absolutely. The sources confirm that in that same period, there was an incredible concentration of prophetic voices. You've got figures like Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Obadiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, all of them, contemporaries, all delivering the exact same message.
Which was?
Repent or the city will be destroyed. God was basically shouting warnings from every corner. It made Lehi's message part of a consensus, even if it was a very unpopular one.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's talk about Lehi's personal call. Begins with him praying, right?
Yes, and not just a casual prayer. The text says he prayed with all his heart for his people. He was deeply invested. And that intense prayer leads to this really visceral physical experience.
What happened?
He saw a pillar of fire dwelling on a rock. And this wasn't just a fleeting image. It was so overwhelming that the sources say it caused him to, quote, quake and tremble exceedingly. It was like a preparation for something even bigger.
And that bigger thing happens when he gets home. He's exhausted, right?
Exactly. He's totally drained, spiritually saturated. He casts himself on his bed, is overcome by the Spirit, and then he's carried away in this full-blown divine vision.
And what's fascinating is how layered this vision is.
It is. First, he sees the entire divine court. The heavens open. He sees God sitting on a throne, surrounded by, numberless angels singing and praising. So right away, the ultimate context of truth and power is established.
But then it gets more specific. The focus narrows.
It does. It shifts to the Messiah. He sees one descending, and the description is incredible. His luster was above that of the sun at noonday, and he's followed by 12 others, and their brightness exceeded the stars in the firmament.
So it's a message of hope right in the middle of all this impending doom.
Precisely. It's not just about destruction, it's about redemption. And then comes the pivotal moment. The first figure stands before Lehi and gives him a book to read.
And reading this book changes everything for him.
Instantly, as Lehi read, he was filled with the Spirit, and the gravity of the situation just hit him. The book delivered the judgment. Woe unto Jerusalem for its abominations. It foretold its complete destruction, that many people would die by the sword and many would be carried away captive into Babylon.
So it wasn't just that they'd be destroyed, but specifically how. And Lehi's reaction isn't fear for himself.
No, it's worship, pure praise for God's power and mercy. And that feeling compelled him to go out immediately and testify. Not just about the destruction, but crucially, about the coming of the Messiah and the redemption of the world. It was a warning, but a warning rooted in love.
So how did his neighbors, the educated, powerful people in the city, take this message?
The response was immediate, and it was violent. The sources are very clear on this. They mocked him, they got angry, and they explicitly sought his life.
They wanted to kill him.
Yes. They treated him exactly like the prophets of old, the ones they had cast out and stoned and slain. Lehi had become a marked man just for speaking an unwelcome truth. The situation had become lethal.
And that danger, of course, is the catalyst for the next part of the story. The flight. The Lord warns him to flee, and he has to drop everything.
Everything. Their wealth, their home, their social standing, all of it, just to save their lives.
Which brings us to the narrator of this journey, Lehi's son, Nephi.
Right. And Nephi starts his record by kind of establishing his credentials. He says he was born of goodly parents and was taught somewhat in all the learning of his father.
That's an important detail.
It is. It tells us he had a strong educational background, which was critical for the huge documentation task he was about to undertake. He was literate and learned.
And he had a very specific skill set for this, too. He wrote his record, which was an abridgment of his father's, in the language of the Jews, but also the language of the Egyptians.
Yes, and that combination is fascinating. Think of the language of the Jews as the scriptural language, like an ancient Hebrew. But the language of the Egyptians was probably more like a script or a shorthand.
For practical use.
Exactly. A functional, space-saving alphabet used for business or record-keeping. This is probably why later sources refer to a variation called Reformed Egyptian. It likely wasn't a brand new language, but an abbreviated script based on Egyptian characters, designed to be written efficiently on metal plates.
So he was uniquely equipped for the job. Okay, so the family that leaves includes Lehi, his wife Sariah, and the 4 sons, Leman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. And this trip into the wilderness is not a weekend camping trip.
Oh, it was grueling. Their first major stop was a place 3 days' journey beyond the shores of the Red Sea.
Let's break that down. What does that mean in terms of distance?
Well, the distance from Jerusalem down to the Gulf of Aqaba is roughly 180 miles, and that's through incredibly hot, barren country. So they had to travel that 180 miles and then go another 3 days inland from there.
So maybe 12 to 14 days of just constant, difficult trekking just to get to their first camp. That kind of journey would take a huge emotional toll.
A massive toll. And the sources imply they didn't take much. Tents and whatever food they could carry. You see that strain almost immediately in the family dynamic.
Especially for Sariah, his wife.
Absolutely. You have to remember her perspective. She's watching her husband lead her 4 sons into a barren wasteland based entirely on a vision.
And that strain shows up right away in the sons. Lehi, as soon as they pitch their tent, what does he do?
He performs an act of pure faith. He builds an altar of stones, makes an offering, and gives thanks to God for their protection. It shows that even in the middle of nowhere, gratitude and obedience are his first instinct.
But his 2 oldest sons, Laman and Lemuel, see the exact same situation completely differently. They immediately start to murmur.
Right. And this idea of murmuring is so important here. It's more than just complaining that it's hot.
It's a spiritual problem.
It's spiritual sickness, really, a pattern of disbelief. Our sources detail a pretty clear 3-step progression to it. First, they begin to question. They question their father's wisdom, the validity of God's command.
And from questioning, they move to the next step.
Which is to rationalize and excuse their disobedience. They say things like, "We're foolish for leaving our land and our possessions." They justify their fear and use it as an excuse not to obey.
And that rationale leads to the final step.
Slothfulness. Inactivity. If you convince yourself the command is foolish or impossible, you stop trying. You become slow, resistant. You complain about how hard it is, instead of looking for the strength to do it.
And Nephi is the total opposite of this. He seeks his own witness, he gains this knowledge of God's goodness, and he relies on God for strength. He even states the whole theme for his record right at the beginning.
He does. It's a beautiful summary of this principle. He says he wants to show that the tender mercies of the Lord are over all those whom he hath chosen, because of their faith, to make them mighty even unto the power of deliverance.
That phrase, tender mercies, it's really powerful.
It is, and it's worth pausing on. It's not just some generic protection. One modern source elaborates on this beautifully, saying tender mercies are personalized blessings. They are strength, protection, assurance, guidance, consolation. All these spiritual gifts.
I love that idea, that they're personalized, tailored for you.
Precisely. They are individualized and suited specifically according to the conditions of the children of men. They're exactly what you need in your specific circumstance. Lehi and Nephi are in a wilderness, but they're promised deliverance. This explains why Nephi can go through all this and still feel highly favored of the Lord.
While Laman and Lemuel, who have the same physical protection, just feel afflicted and lost.
Exactly. It's all about their spiritual perspective.
That realization that being favored isn't about avoiding the wilderness, but surviving it with God's help, is the perfect foundation for what comes next. Because now, the Lord tells them to go right back into the lion's mouth.
Right. The command comes, go back to Jerusalem and get the brass plates. This isn't just difficult, it's heading back into the extreme danger they just barely escaped.
And this is where we get one of the most famous declarations of faith in all of Scripture. Nephi's response is so simple, but so absolute.
I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded.
That commitment, this is just total.
It is. One analysis I read noted that Nephi basically makes God his partner in this. For him, if he failed, it wouldn't just be his failure. It would mean God had commanded something impossible and had failed to prepare a way. And since God doesn't fail, Nephi's success was, to him, non-negotiable.
So the big question is why? Why risk absolutely everything for these plates? What made them worth more than their lives?
They were the bedrock of everything. Their civilization, their history, their spiritual identity. The brass plates contained 4 essential things: the record of the Jews, the law of Moses, the first 5 books, the genealogy of their ancestors, and critically, prophecies from ancient prophets like Zanok, Neum, and Zenos.
Prophets whose writings aren't all in our Old Testament today.
Exactly. They spoke specifically about the coming of the Messiah and salvation, but their writings weren't fully preserved in the standard canon. Without these plates, those crucial prophecies would have been lost to them forever. The plates were their religious future.
And there's a really powerful example in the sources of what happens when a society doesn't have a record like this.
Yes, the Mulekites. A tragic example. They fled Jerusalem about 11 years after Lehi's family, but they didn't take any scriptures with them. Within just a few generations, their language had corrupted, their civilization declined, and they had dwindled in apostasy and unbelief. They completely lost their knowledge of God.
Wow, so the plates were literally the difference between survival and spiritual oblivion.
Literally.
So Nephi goes back. His brothers complain the whole way, of course.
Yeah.
And his approach is defined by faith, not by some detailed plan.
That's right. He famously goes forth not knowing beforehand what he should do. And that detail is so instructive, it shows you that faith isn't a blueprint. Nephi had the mission, go get the plates. But he didn't have a step-by-step manual. He had to act first and trust that direction would come.
Logic would say to wait for a map. Faith told him to just start walking.
Exactly. And that leads us to probably the most difficult incident in this whole story, the slaying of Laban. This raises a huge moral question for any reader. How did the sources frame this? It's a really tough part of the narrative. And the justification provided in the sources is stark. It's rooted in this theological idea that the Lord sets the standard of right and wrong, and whatever God requires is right.
But they also point to Laban's character, right?
They do. The sources emphasize that Laban wasn't an innocent man. He was a liar, a robber, and he had already tried to murder Lehi's sons twice just to steal their property.
And he was given chances to comply.
At least 2 chances to part with the plates peaceably. The spiritual math of the situation, as the source presents it, was that the life of one very wicked man, who had arguably forfeited his own right to live, was required to ensure the survival of the scriptural record for millions of future people.
So not a general license for violence.
No, absolutely not. A unique, dire command to preserve the spiritual foundation of an entire nation. A necessary, terrible act to prevent total spiritual loss.
Okay, so Nephi gets the plates, but he still has one more problem. Laban's servant, Zoram, sees what happened and is terrified he's next.
And his fear is completely rational. Nephi tries to calm him down, promises he won't be harmed, but, promises are easy to break. Zoram is about to run, which would have exposed the whole family.
So what's the turning point? What secures Zoram's trust?
It was an oath. Nephi doesn't just promise again. He swears, as the Lord liveth and as I live.
And that phrase meant something very specific.
It meant everything. In ancient Semitic culture, that was the most sacred, most inviolable covenant you could possibly make. Swearing by God's life and your own life immediately validated Nephi's integrity. It transformed Zoram from a captive into a covenant brother. The oath was more binding than any contract.
What an incredible cultural detail. So finally, after all that risk, they return to the camp with this incredible treasure.
And Lehi's reaction is just beautiful. He rejoiced exceedingly. The text says he immediately began to search the plates, was filled with the Spirit, and saw that the prophecies were true. It was the ultimate confirmation that his vision was real, their flight was commanded, and that their sacrifice was worth it.
It's a monumental journey, and they haven't even really started the long trek yet. So let's zoom out. What are the core lessons for you, the listener, from this deep dive so far?
I think there are 3 essential takeaways. First, the absolute power of heeding prophetic warnings, even when they're unpopular and dangerous. Second, you see this sharp contrast between murmuring, that sickness of questioning, rationalizing, and then doing nothing, and seeking testimony, which leads to knowledge and being highly favored.
And the third one, tied right to Nephi, is that powerful principle that God will prepare a way for us to obey. Even when we have to go forward, not knowing beforehand what we should do, we just have to act on the faith we have.
That really leads to the core promise that runs through all of this source material. The sources say over and over again that if the faithful keep the commandments, they will prosper in the land.
Right, but that word prosper is so tricky.
Yeah.
It's so easy for us to misunderstand it today. We think it means ease or money, but Lehi and Nephi spent years suffering and fighting, even while they were being perfectly obedient.
Exactly. The promise of prosperity shows up over 30 times, yet their lives were demonstrably hard. So prosperity in this context, it doesn't mean a life free from trials. It means the Lord will sustain you and uphold you. He'll ensure your survival, your knowledge, your identity, even in the middle of great difficulties.
It's about sustained spiritual strength, not the absence of trouble.
That's it exactly. It's about eventual deliverance.
That distinction changes everything. It completely reframes how you define success.
It really does. So here's our final thought for you to take with you from this deep dive. If true prosperity means being sustained by the Lord through your afflictions, rather than being protected from them, how does focusing on Christ, the way Lehi and Nephi did, change your definition of success in your life today? The challenge isn't to avoid the wilderness, it's finding the resolve to build that altar of gratitude right in the middle of it.